Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. And Israeli minister Tzipi Livni has confirmed what many people have been suspecting for years. She says Riyadh and Tel Aviv are united in their stance against Iran. It is not just Iran that the two seem to be in agreement upon, but also they are on the same side of the Syrian situation, supporting Salafist extremists. The question is why? Why is Riyadh allied with Tel Aviv more than the Islamic government of Iran? What are the underlying reasons for the unholy Israeli-Saudi alliance and its partnership?
A new alliance is emerging in the Middle East. That's how analysts interpret a public change of policy in Israel and Saudi Arabia, which have long seemed to be enemies and have no diplomatic ties. The latest sign of this unholy alliance is the remarks of Israel's cabinet minister Tzipi Livni. She said that Israel and Saudi Arabia are united in their opposition to Iran.
I think that you can hear that Arabic sounds familiar to Hebrew when it comes to Iran.
Quite complicated.
What Livni said is a rare public linkage between the goals of the Israelis and Saudis. Both accuse Iran of seeking nuclear weapons and want an end to its nuclear program. Tel Aviv has time and again openly spoken of military action against Iran over its nuclear program. Diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks also said that Saudi King Abdullah had frequently urged the U.S. to attack Iran to put an end to its nuclear activities. Taking into consideration that Tel Aviv and Riyadh have long had similar stances on Iran, the question now is, what binds them together? Analysts believe that one of the main reasons is the recent diplomatic engagement between Iran and the U.S., a strong ally of both Israel and Saudi Arabia. This, along with the U.S. stances on other developments in the Middle East, like the war in Syria, have made both Israel and Saudi Arabia feel isolated in the region.
Saudi Arabia, like Israel, is beginning to feel itself isolated and vulnerable. I think the Saudis probably know that behind closed doors, Obama and people that really matter are getting as fed up with the Saudis as they are with the Israelis. And I honestly think that the new alliance that's emerging in the Middle East is actually Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Others believe that Israel and Saudi Arabia seek something else. They say their opposition to Iran's nuclear program or pushing for a military strike on the Syrian government is aimed at a greater goal.
This is where Saudi policy and Israeli policy coincide completely in regard to their mutual agreement, it seems to me, and mutual desire that there be a regime change in Iran. The present situation in Syria is nothing more than a prelude in their thinking to the eventual achievement of a regime change in Tehran.
Days ago, Saudi Arabia spoke of a planned shift in its dealings with the U.S. A source close to Saudi intelligence chief Bandar bin Sultan said the decision was over a number of issues, including the crisis in Syria, the uprising in Bahrain, and a possible thaw in the relations between the U.S. and Iran. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has denied emergence of disagreements between Washington and Riyadh. However, analysts say the U.S. is taking a cautious approach towards Saudi Arabia and Israel when it comes to Iran.
An open conflict with Iran could bring about a series of unintended consequences upon the United States and upon Israel that make this a policy worth rethinking. This is one time when I think Barack Obama has correctly exercised caution in regard to having Mr. Netanyahu and the Saudis dragging him into something that could potentially have global implications.
Well, I'd like to welcome my guest to the program from Crescent and Cross Solidarity Movement, Mr. Mark Glenn out of Idaho. And from the Middle East program, also Associate Fellow of the Middle East program at Chatham House, Yossi Melko-Bird. Thank you both for being with us and coming out of London. Appreciate you being with us. Well, let's start it off in London now. What do you think that Livni exactly meant by saying that when it comes to Iran, Israel and Saudi Arabia basically speak the same language?
You know, probably you should interview Tzipi Livni to know exactly what she meant, but I guess what she's trying to say, this is real politics. And in the current circumstances, Saudi Arabia and Israel have common of interests, which we know is usually the strongest of bonds in international relations, and both of them want to stop Iran from develop nuclear military capability. as the report earlier says, already we know it from WikiLeaks, if we didn't know it even without it, that the Saudis were encouraging the United States and maybe Israel as well to act and stop this nuclear project. And now there is apprehension both in Israel and in Saudi Arabia that the current diplomatic efforts to negotiate between the United States and Iran about some arrangement to stop the nuclear program actually will lead for the continuation of the program. It will be done behind the scenes, and as a result of that, they would like actually to increase the sanctions, to continue the sanction. They are fearing that the United States is moving too far because they don't want to get involved in military action, and as a result, Iran will manage actually to continue develop nuclear military capabilities.
Okay, what about that, Mr. Mark Glenn, what our guest in London has said, that basically Saudi Arabia and Israel have common bonds, especially on this situation dealing with Iran's, as he called it, the nuclear weapons program. Your take, sir, what is that all about?
Well, first and foremost, let's be honest in saying that there is no Iranian nuclear weapons program. This is a red herring that has been debunked 1,000 times over the last 30 years. It is just an excuse that is used to, first of all, rally the Sunni countries in the Middle East behind Israel and the United States, and also as a precursor to what we saw take place against Iraq 20 years ago, which was the invasion and destruction of that country under the auspices, first and foremost, of repelling an invasion into Kuwait, and then after 9/11 into preventing Iraq from developing nuclear weapons. So this is a red herring. What Saudi Arabia and Israel are truly afraid of is that Iran is going to become the powerhouse of the Middle East and is going to be able to bring order to an otherwise chaotic situation. Israel can only exist in a neighborhood where all of her neighbors are squabbling and disoriented and scurrying around, unable to formulate their foreign policy objectives in a way that benefits their own national interests. And with Iran and her history, particularly of having fought and won true independence 30 plus years ago, this is a serious danger to continued Israeli hegemony in the region and maintaining control over these countries that have to be kept basically blind and in the dark so that they can be controlled. And Saudi Arabia, of course, being the headquarters of Islam, so to speak, Saudi Arabia would like to see herself as the Islamic powerhouse of the region. And I'm sure that this is exactly the promises that have been floated to the royal family there, that as long as they continue to do Israeli and American bidding in the region, that they will continue to occupy the kinds of positions that they do. But let's just be frank about this. The United States and Israel have made it clear to Saudi Arabia that if Saudi Arabia does not play ball according to Israeli interests, then you will see Arab revolutions taking place in Saudi Arabia that we saw take place over the last 3 years in places such as Tunisia and Egypt.
Okay, well, what about Mr. Mecklenburg? It appears that Riyadh despises Tehran. If you agree with that assessment, why do you think that is the case?
Let me put something first. Whether it's a red herring that Iran develops nuclear weapons or not, it's not the issue from Saudi Arabia or Israel. They believe that this is the case, and countries act upon what they believe is right. Maybe the other guess is right that Iran is not developing nuclear military capability, but in Israel and in Saudi Arabia there is a sense that this is what is happening, and they see it as an existential threat. And yes, they are afraid of Iranian hegemony, rightly or wrongly. Now, as a result of it, they cooperating. What I would like to say also that, if anything, Israel could have learned from what's happening in the region in the last 3 years, that with the Arab Spring and the series of revolutions, is that it has very little influence in the Middle East. And in many ways, it was a humbling experience for Israel as a result that things happened which not necessarily serve the Israeli interest. And probably, you know, the idea that Israel, yes, it's a powerhouse, it's a military and economic powerhouse in the Middle East, but at the same time, it has very little impact of what's happening in countries like Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, and definitely in Saudi Arabia or Iran. If it wants actually to survive in the Middle East, it probably should concentrate on having peace with the Palestinians.
Well, let me just expand on my question and actually your answer, Mr. Mickelberg, because you said it's what countries perceive to be a threat, and whether Iran has the nuclear program or not, military program or not, it's what they perceive. Yeah. However, Riyadh knows that Israel has a nuclear weapons program. So why isn't Riyadh targeting Tel Aviv when we know that Israel has nuclear weapons?
Well, as you know better than me, the Shia-Sunni divide is in many ways stronger than the one between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia doesn't see Israel as a direct threat to her position in the Arab world or in the Muslim or Islamic world. They do see Iran as a threat to their position in the region and the Al Saud family, and that's probably the reaction.
Okay, what about that, Mark? What is it about the Takfiris, Wahhabis, and the Zionists that there seems to be this common alliance?
Well, the basic commonality to it is religious extremism and the justification of using the most horrendous types and level of violence in achieving that type of religious fundamentalism in the political world. All anyone needs to do is to look at what has happened in the Middle East since the Israelis moved in from Europe and have literally butchered tens, if not hundreds of thousands of innocent people, something that Israeli leaders and other pundits have bragged about laughingly over the last 5 or 6 decades. So in effect, you do have this, there's an old saying in the West that birds of a feather flock together. And I think that that is what we're seeing here with regards to the Wahhabists and the Zionists, basically forming this marriage made in hell, where Israel can utilize these strains of religious extremism in order to have these thugs and these murderers go out and affect Israel's foreign policy objectives in the region without Israel actually having to get her hands dirty or to suffer the worldwide condemnation that would befall her if she were directly involved in it.
All right, let's switch over to our Facebook viewers. We want to get some of their comments in on this discussion. Let's check them out.
Funny how Saudi Arabia is angry at the US for not attacking 2 Muslim countries, Iran and Syria. Saudi Arabia is the only country which openly supports terrorism and is still an ally of America because of oil for security deals with Americans.
What about that, Mr. Mickelberg? Do you think that basically that Zionism and Wahhabism, basically 2 different sides of the same coin, both supporting basically superiority, both basically supporting extremist elements, barbarism, death and destruction? Do you see a similarity at all?
I really think, you know, the vitriolic language that your other guests and also you are using, of butchering and Israeli butcher. You know, the Middle East is unfortunately a violent place. I don't like it. I think, you know, I wish to see a Middle East which respects human rights, respect the civil rights and political rights of everyone. But, you know, I think it doesn't come only from Israel. I don't need to mention to you the Iran-Iraq war, the use of chemical weapons by Iraq, the violence that's going on now in Iraq, Syria, that more than 100,000 people were killed. The wars between Israel and its neighbors, yes, Israel should take responsibility for quite a bit, but on many cases also the Arab countries, the Palestinians themselves should take responsibility. It's a complex area. I think this kind of language which puts the blame on one and use vitriolic language is not helpful. Right now, the alliance between what seems to be sort of alliance between the Saudi Arabia and Israel, derives from, they see this as common interest. Personally, I think it's misguided. I actually think that in the long term, Iran and Israel should be allies in the regions and not with, with Saudi Arabia. But this is a different matter. I don't like the kind of Islam that comes with Wahhabism. I prefer the more, more moderate type of religion all in all. And maybe the role of religion in the Middle East is very problematic because it encourages violence. Right now, if you look at the specific of the issue of nuclear, both Israel and Saudi Arabia find common interest in this. And in my mind, actually, they should let the United States to negotiate a solution with Iran around the nuclear issue. And maybe it will create a better situation in the region. I think they are overreacting.
Mark Glenn, I want to get your reaction to our guest's language. He said that Israel perhaps should allow the United States to negotiate with Iran. I want to look at that perspective in general. Is it Tel Aviv that is determining what Washington does in the Middle East and other parts of the world when it comes, especially if Israel feels that it is against their interests or pro their interests? Is it Tel Aviv that is basically telling Washington what to do and what not to do?
Well, certainly Tel Aviv does tell Washington what to do and what not to do. However, in this case, we see a very interesting development that has occurred, which is that Netanyahu has become so loud, he has become so brash, that the smarter elements within the pro-Israel Zionist community have gotten very nervous at his very loud and very gangsterish behavior, and they are working to shut him up, to build a cage around him and to put a gag around his mouth so that he doesn't make too much noise and really expose Zionism for the truly ugly, racist, and extremist ideology that it is. So in this case, what you have with the administration of Barack Obama is that you have pro-Israel interests who are firmly in control of that administration. However, what they would like to see right now is a quieting of things. They would like to see things cool off because the entire world is waking up now to the problems associated with Jewish power and with Zionism in general. And so just like any organized crime family, you know, that where the heat is getting to be too much and the public is beginning to put pressure on the political class and on law enforcement to do something about these criminals. And so a smart organized crime family will say, okay, let's pull back our operations a little bit because the public is getting wise to our ways and we need them to go back to sleep if we're going to continue on with our criminal behavior. Okay. And I think that is what is going on right now, is that you have people, smarter elements in the pro-Israel community who want to shut Benjamin Netanyahu up.
Mr. Mekelberg, you were shaking your head. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, you know, what we hear from the other guests is the same sort of old slogans, which, you know, come from very dark days about the Jewish power. There is an Israeli lobby and no Jewish power. Yes, they are trying to promote Israeli interests. I personally don't agree with a lot of them, but it's part of the debate. The United States is a democracy, and there is a debate. And I, for instance, don't like the line that AIPAC is taking, but I'm not using, again, the kind of language that your other guest is using, and it's regrettable. Yes, I think that Netanyahu gave quite an hysteric speech in the United Nations. It was inappropriate, and I would rather see the United States in Iran start this kind of engagement, start this opening, find a way to overcome the differences in the last 34, 35 years, and maybe start a process in the Middle East that Iran is part of the Middle East, is not seen as a threatening force in the area, and start engagement between Iran, the United States, hopefully later with the Sunni world, and also with Israel. But for this, we actually need a language which is more conciliatory and less vitriolic.
Okay, what about that, Mr. Glenn? We're just about out of time, but looking at the situation, because our guest in London talked about the very sensitive area of the Middle East and so many conflicts, but the roots of these conflicts, would you say that the majority of these conflicts are rooted, let's say, in similar entities that are behind the main problems? He talked about Iraq, he talked about Syria. if we look at the roots of the problem, what would you say are the roots of the majority of the problems that exist in the Middle East? Mark Glenn.
Well, first and foremost, what I would like to say is it was a common phrase early in the 20th century for mobsters and other organized crime figures when they were asked the question, you know, what about the mafia? What about the mob? They would say there's no such thing as the mafia. There's no such thing as the mob. That's just racism. That's just bigotry. And that's how I would equate the language that Mr. Mecklenburg is using here in trying to deny the fact that, yes, there is this thing known as Zionism. There is this thing known as Jewish power. And for him to try and deny that is the equivalent of gangsters in the past denying that there was anything related to the mafia or the mob. As far as the other things that he listed, he talked about the Iran-Iraq war. He talked about the destruction of Syria. Yes, the fulcrum around which all of this turns is Israel. We didn't have this kind of problem until this virus in the Middle East sprung up about a century ago known as Israel.
Absolutely clueless.
And no, I'm not absolutely
ignorant.
clueless. You are absolutely deceptive in your language. Everybody, the whole world knows it. Just you and a few other people are trying to maintain this fantasy that there's no such thing as a Zionist problem. You are a liar. By way of deception, thou shalt do war. That is the motto of Israel's Mossad. And you are engaging in the very same behavior, sir. There's no such thing as the mafia. There's no such thing as the mob. Israel is the thorn in the flesh of the Middle East. As soon as it is removed, there will be no Shia-Sunni divide. There will be no terrorism. The Middle East will go back to being the cradle of civilization that it was a millennia ago. And this whole entire episode will just be one bad memory.
I'm going to have to interrupt both of you because we are out of time, but I appreciate you both being with us, and perhaps we'll have both of you back on another program. Thanking Mr. Mark Glenn out of Idaho from the Crescent and Cross Solidarity Movement, and also Mr. Yossi Mecklenburg from the Middle East program of Chatham House in London. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us for another debate. Make sure you join us right here, same time, same station tomorrow. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thanks so much for being with us, and goodbye.